Hello, everybody. This is Empty Turtle. I'm here with Dr. David Jubb, and this is jubbtalk. Please remember to subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed today's show. It is titled Approaching Detachment. Say hello, Dr. Jubb.
I think you come up with good headliners. Approaching. It's like as if we're flying. I think that's true. Would you think that we've got a fancy flight craft?
I know mine is.
Is yours anti-gravity?
Of course.
Okay. Well,
all the latest bells and whistles.
But the birds in the heaven that actually master over the heavens, the intelligence of the bird could go in any direction. So the hummingbird was the master of war for the indigenous people, the Toltec tradition here.
Well, a lot of people really don't see the hummingbird as a bird of war.
Yes, because of a paradigm paralysis that's crept a little because of a military industrial complex. But in fact, it is. Would you not imagine that the most flexible, of course, is the pen, of course, which is mightier than the sword. It's just that very formidableness is that where something could just go in any direction, like a wasp, for instance. People could be afraid of that wasp, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So we're approaching detachment to achieve perfect detachment, right?
Well, if you can hover in the air, most birds can't do that. That's kind of like, wasps can do that too. Mosquitoes can also.
Bees.
But what if your ability to move was like a thousandth of a second in your reflex, when ours might only be like 100 less, so it's in a thousandth of a second somebody could have moved. But anyway, attachments, wherever it is, right, if you're talking about that, it's sort of to a form of stupidity, because if you're hovering in the air and you can hover, you can imagine the power of being able to hover, right? Versus, you just got to keep moving, sort of thing, to stay in the air. Yes. So it's quite. But the East, in the medicine world, the Beloved always had these ceremonies, and they didn't mind all the wind or anything that was going on. But we've got a bit of wind around us. But in the East, they always would have yellow, where it was sort of the colour of the sun, orange, yellow, and it was also about new beginnings. And so to have new beginnings, it came from a void. And so the void was the present, and this was the gift, and it's something that's sort of unwrapped. So kind of not, when somebody was in there thinking, kind of, they were not in eye awareness per se, basically. But the medicine wheel represented the four corners of the earth, and quite amazing to me that here was a people who really were aware of all the four corners of the earth, actually, in their ceremony, you see. And it was a fusion, and it always was presented as such. So you would look then to go from the east, which would be like the eagle and the sun rising and things such like this, and everything was sort of like in the medicine world. Could you think about this as a ceremony you went through? But you would go through just pieces of it, and it would just be asking everyone to consider, well, what's new, sort of thing. That's one thing. They'd move around to the south and just be about the things that are growing and the growth of everything. And also then the field mouse and the coyote, because the field mouse sees things up close and processes small chunks of information. And the coyote is sort of very playful, like the trickster part of everything in ourselves, which is the balanced piece of ourselves in the south, the medicine world. And then the west was always like blue, if you could get it, but black would represent that too, because it's very dark blue, which is black actually. But blue would be quite amazing colour of the sky. And so they only used the word sky to be the colour, in fact, blue. And it was the same word that they used when they'd see blue inside anything, it would be the sky. So they had two words for colour, and basically the same words for your pee and your poop. Yeah, so one was brown and one was yellow, sort of thing. But where the south really was represented by the mouse, you could see a real up close sort of detail, but playfulness there and growth, and this would be multiplying things. And in the west, it was sort of a setting of the sun, the Satan sun, and you'd hear that Satan, Satan sun. And within you and I is like a principle being where things are shed away, which is old, to make way for things new. And so this sort of is part of a cosmology, and you represent by the bear because it would be the symbol of birth in the dream time. So birth would happen through the bear in the dream time of the bear, the mother bear, and she would wake, and the bear would already be suckling and everything, for some time, after the winter. But it would be just sort of like when they would go up to the north in themselves, they would sense these things. They would feel where the trees had lost their leaves, showing us their some more bare essence. And this is really to do with wisdom and discernment, and things like this in a more concentrated form of energy to survive, and these sorts of things. So sort of the flow buffs or the buffaloes, the buffaloes were, they'd put their hide up to the west, to the cold wind north, and pretty thick hide would manage sort of relative the cold and things. But visualizing sort of gaps where anyone is, and in all and everything, there's nothing phenomenon, meaning that either you've got the right percentage of cells behind you, to affect something or not. But I was just going to ask you, if you're on a hill, right, in a car, and you've got your foot on the brake, and you see cars just, beside you going forward, suddenly you kind of like put your foot on the brake, don't you? Because even more. Because the ingrained predicament for our own self on the hill, of course, is just that our car has slipped back, because our concern is that we're on a hill and we want to make sure that we've maintained our position. And so we directly interpreted just a moment of a car moving forward as a manner that we had slipped back ourselves. A good example would be when you get on a train, for instance. You're thinking to go in one direction, and again the train on the other side starts to go in the other direction, and everybody leans forward, though the train which we're on hasn't moved. So this is sort of an example of the body being the mind's experience of itself. But attachments where anybody is, like for instance, there's the what are those dot diagrams? There's stereograms. Good. The stereogram is a good example. It's like where youth is. The young ones can see the three-dimensional picture that jumps out from the stereogram, and people who are more flexible in their brain can quickly pick it out, and so suddenly they could read books, they could see visual pictures and everything, and not anybody else could see those. So it's an interesting thing that the older the brain, the less flexible something could have come to be. But that could have occurred at a young age, as you know, where somebody became just fixed and set sort of more in their way. But at the beginning of the program, you said, "Oh well, let's come in for a landing," and that's sort of like, well, if you could hover, how about that? You see?
Well, make landing a lot easier.
Yeah, well, listening where somebody is, of course, in listen speech, your landing is actual, because if it's coming from listen speech, then you've got rid of every single bias where you are yourself, because you've just been able to speak to who was listening, and so everything was more shaped, more of this. And so if you're visualizing the gap sort of between the beats, now we're getting into what this is more about. If we can feel what this is, the gaps between the beats, you see. So that's like how relaxed is someone's shoulders, how relaxed is their tummy, These are sorts of things. But points of direction where anything is in the medicine wheel would have been used just as a synesthesia type of a technique, that you'd be going ahead and using this to feel better in your own self, you see, as you heard this. And so it would be really you being able to apply things more as a medicine itself and create transformation more within, because you'd be using a process which something like a grassroots technique, for instance, for getting rid of conflict would be valuing the conflict at peace and growing that piece up. And this is an art, of course, it's an art form, and some people are very good at it and others, could learn more about this in whole brain functioning or something. But you've really got everything which is self, but then you've got the lip biter, which people could go back and learn more from the programs past about the lip biter and having self-interest only when that really does harm society, for instance. And those who contribute really to another to gain, but yet for themselves, it's sort of, that's really a deer-eyed type of condition that goes on body language-wise, which is sort of really attachments where something is, where micro-expressions are. There always is the sort of fixed things going on in the channels below, which is generally not congruent but conflicted, in fact, you see. So there's simultaneous and sequential types of incongruency, and that could be another program that we talk about, because we're talking about coming in for a landing, and this is about perfect detachment, because where something is detached, it means no bias existed in math, you see, and an inference that comes from it then is a fact itself, you see. It's more real. So the things which is permanent is real, right? And that which is sort of illusion more is like matter. It's sort of more temporary in itself. Whereas this which was in the fourth dimension, that I is, which is below hydrogen, is something that is held by the living, and that living is a memory in the ether, and this was what actually witnessed your nativity to come to earth, you see. So it is there with you in your own self, matter of fact, right throughout life, and this is the child that's within. And this is sort of about creativeness, about your spontaneity, and spontaneous creative intelligence being the primary principle that the Toltec taught, which was like playfulness sort of is our original condition, you see. But the speckled snake was really fantastic. He sort of really lived around Andrew Jackson's time, mate, and he just was Cloud's favourite. What about George Carlin? You think today people, there's quite a bit of an art form. I think he was a great art form.
He's one of the best stand-ups, and he really took it to a level that he just made it work, and he was smart, and people loved him.
And what about Robin Williams was another?
Oh yeah, and he in his own way, brilliant, just like Carlin, but he did it he had a different approach.
So a structure in truth-telling exists, doesn't it, in fact? And then an actual fact that like a picture could really sort of say 10,000 words, right? So in a picture, oh my God, we could get a lot of information, and it would take 10,000 words to catch up to a picture. So if you give people a picture, I think it's a better way to do it, isn't it? So for instance, like if you could see like a potter on a wheel drawing a clay bowl up, you could see that where the clay isn't, the usefulness of the bowl is, right? So that's a good example. Another example might be that they would teach you would be like, well, where the lodge poles are, the usefulness of the lodge isn't. And it's only where the space is that they create is the usefulness of the lodge itself. And so this is sort of like what you're, say, coming in for a landing. It's sort of really where judgment is more without bias, for instance, or without attachment. We stand by those things. And 1, 2, 3, you don't have to look inside anyone else. You found a heart inside them, and so you'd know everyone has a heart. So there's something very deductive about this. And so it's interesting that change only ever occurs because of a small band of a committed few, and then the mavericks, and which are people who study the work and everything, and then or artists, because like a T-shirt or something which has a slogan on it, or something which exists like this is real art. And I'd say that this is the real soldiers, and in a manner of being, they all saw this really as a hummingbird, and they took an approach to wherever something was to change it, and they would go full on every direction, three-dimensionally, you see. Yeah, the Toltecs taught people strategy, like, so for instance, if you were surrounded, they would teach you what the condition is where you are in formlessness of being invisible and suddenly being invisible, or being invisible as part of an act of being, so that something could be weak where it is, and you've gone through where that is, but then what's there is costs a fortune to uphold the past, you see.
When were the Toltecs prevalent?
They finished up in the 1100s, in fact, pretty much, and by the 1200 AD, they were done for relative. The last sultan, really. But that teachings and things that was relate to that is so incredible, matter of fact. It's astounding, because the whole thing was really about I and this self-autonomy versus having some rule hall which would be autocratic and taking people's rights away, basically. But it's quite an amazing a story about common law and things, but these people really had studied various skills, and like, oh my God, like they'd studied how to be in the dark, and that was a certain sort of nagul. They had people that had absolutely studied space and the vestibular sense, and they were radical. They could be engaged and involved where underground things were. You had celestial conditions that related to being able to read the forces of the moon and these sorts of things. So some people knew various stone and things that's like this that would be extremely important for bringing light more underground and this sort of thing. But then there were people who knew more or less sort of what plants grew more in the dark and these sorts of things, quite incredible, matter of fact, food-wise, and how to bring light more, like the sunlight, what can be, if that existed, but it might have been cold, and they would situate themselves where it would be warm, and they found places to be always where it would be warm, you see, in these things. But, anything that really is truth, of course, has a structure, basic, and formlessness is part of it, you would say. Yeah, So, right.
Well, truth should be effortless, right?
Yeah, well, what's effortless, as you point out, is a path of least resistance. This is Occam's razor, like where anyone's thinking that sort of like there's got to be, as there is if there is, a simple solution to something, then, it's that's what you do. But it's when you hear something that's like this, it's really more stellar to you, because emptiness, which is I, is stellar space, you see, and this is your center point. Well, how could any fear be got in there, you see, because it's like there's no space for water to seep into something which is afloat, per se. You imagine what this is. And so you've kept fear out, because no space has been rented for fear, in fact, you see. And so pleasure attached evermore disappeared, because there was not a reason for pleasure to be attached. It's an interesting thing that what's pleasant is only +1.
So if pleasure is not attached to it, folks,
get
rid of it.
Yeah, no. Well, yes, that's right. But it's +1. But what's negative is -3.
Should we demand that
It's
pleasure
about
be
-3.
attached?
Well, you have to have at least 5 to get bigger and larger as resource state. 5 positive states chained together to always collapse a negative state. You see, which is always got a value at least of 3. So, but So you're getting a little bit more of a resource state to be able to collapse the stuck state, because the septal region of the brain, which lets you into the frontal cortex where someone's listening, this is their faculty to inspire creative influence of the future. And where you would be more disarmed, like you said, and be just hovering in or coming in for a landing. You'd be arriving, returning. You'd be using words that was more like quality circles, you see, of some feedback back to yourself, sort of thing. That comes just natural where anyone is, honest, if their heart is left to be guiding their tongue without the head having interfered with that too much. But if a center point where it is, where this is, you've got stellar space, which is I, which is eternal, which is the only thing which is absolute, which is I, and am is like 4% of baryonic matter, which we could look at and see light there, and then you've got dark matter and dark energy, which is part of our body, you see. But this is temporary in relation to things more fixed, and that this which is fixed is space itself, like a canvas, and this is I, and am is like everything painted on it, basically, you could say. And this I is aware of what this is, you see, and it's like a black hole where you're looking back at yourself, which if you go out there, you can see in the eye of Aquarius, you can see a gorgeous helix, and it's so beautiful. It is an eye, in fact, and so this eye is looking back at you through, this universe, you see, in this,
So perfect detachment being
not just
the
this
goal,
galaxy.
right? Perfect detachment being the goal. How do we approach detachment to start getting into, or to approach detachment to journey into the goal of perfect detachment? So to approach detachment, do we need to start like doing certain things on a daily basis, or physically or mentally, that'll help us start getting into and prepare for perfect detachment?
Yeah, because what we could do in programs can relate to this for sure, because it's something which somebody learns about. For instance, whole body calibration is being able to look at body movement and whole body movement and track the internal metaphor and condition where someone is, and be able to see what the emotion and a lot of things are about footprint, for instance, things that's like that, that's left behind. And you could read those things. You could see how long someone paused where they were. You could see how did they pause on their feet, who was there with this when they would, and how much time existed in such. And these are things which only can be got by someone who has a state preparation for this, because they have to absolutely be able to hear a pin drop on the carpet, where most wouldn't be able to, because their hearing is always taken to what they have where they're walking. But if it isn't, then you could hear sort of like a stick crack, in the forest. You'd be able to sense like the weight of something there, and this sort of a thing, you see. So they taught the men mainly to not really use speech at all. They actually used body language and sign language, incredible matter of fact. And so everything was done solid through sign language, and so they could talk to each other across a distance, and no one needed to see that, and only someone who saw it could have the language of it. And so they did this mainly because they could easily talk to each other, the men did, and so they could talk to each other without anybody necessarily seeing anything. But there was no need really for inner dialogue, and it's amazing that what's common sense, like, come back to full circle for all of it. It's really fact, which is more situational based, mate, and simple perception, of course. But it's having sticky factor for this, like, versus other things, but it's having sound more, what's sound and transparent, and the practicing of this is literal, and it's really like an athlete. Somebody would start practicing what literalness is itself, which is incredible. The form of it, like George Carlin or anything, is really like of having perfect detachment, which really is like rock bottom surety. You see?
And perfect detachment means what? Nothing can bother you?
It means that you don't have any confounding variable, right? And so you're sure So when Carlin, for instance, or one of these actors, like we just pointed out, would deliver something, it wasn't like anything else could be interpreted about it. It was really like rock bottom and surety in oneself. So you could say just like congruent, meaning parallel processedness. We would think that where emotion was being portrayed, something congruent would be the parallel conditions of things. It would also be the flow between parts where somebody was an expression of this. And then how present tense about it, like versus are they a bit dissociated about how they express that. So it's the surety really would be more cognitive in our syntax ever more as part of what's precognitive, meaning before cognition exists. And so this is a void, and in the void awareness is, which is above deep sleep, it's above dreaming, and it's above wakefulness. Now, wakefulness being very limited phenomenon, and each of the other ones as well, in relation to awareness itself, which is common sense sort of thing. But sometimes there you could see, of course, like what we're saying, what science and common sense might often be wrong, in fact, you see, because we gave examples of that and how the body's the mind's experience of itself. You're on a hill and you're only interpreting something in a set way, but if it were fixed more, you could see instant. But these are the things like a stereogram. Somebody could pick the pattern out of it, for instance, and other people, it could be not so easy to do. But for instance, like another example would be like if you could imagine just right now what would be counterintuitive, like a tsunami is just coming straight now toward us, right? Like, or an asteroid, is approaching us in the sky, which those are things which actually happen to people. But common sense, you'd think, would people run away?
Yes.
Yes, it would. But you see, the argument that could be interjected where any reflection is after or held, it would be more or less or like, by the way. And things that's like that is often sort of like the most important, matter of fact, because it's something which is more other than conscious. And the running away and those sorts of things didn't help, and it maybe made things worse for the person who did that. You see, when they could have got down, got under, or got up, and perhaps that would have helped save themselves instead of running away. But street smarts, like which the whole thing is about more, isn't just a gentle thing. Gentle, kind, and allowing is actual, you see, but street smart is ever more sort of a stopping to consider, sort of having room inside, and something really could be placed ever more which is embellished and embellishing our map that we have. And this is more safe, and assists us more mutually where we are, where the world is, and it's a practical way for us to live more simply. Others can simply live, you see. So it's rudimentary logic. And it's deductive, reason that you've got no confounding variable, you see. So if somebody read a report, I'm asking you, and they went out to get an interview, and when they came back, the report was already filled out on the desk when they got back. And so did they actually collect any information from you?
Didn't matter.
That's right. So this is called selective bias. And so in law enforcement and all sorts of things, there could be just massive selective biases going on. And this is the problem where fishedness exists and things like that, you see. Because people then are only selectively collecting things that would relate to what the issue is, and we would see, well, in science, that's kind of not. Exactly.
Stereotyping, I think, is another word.
Yeah. So if an agent never got isolated as a contagious agent, no one could ever see that anything existed such, and it wasn't ever found such ever. Might somebody stop sort of looking at that because it doesn't exist? Matter of fact, the only thing that did or could be a toxin per se, you see, and that definitely does exist. Yes.
That's right. All right, we'll be back before you know it. We're going to take a break right now. And we're back. Back before you knew it.
It's amazing, yeah, because it's sort of, we've been talking a bit about what's real versus what's illusionary, really. But who is real? Who becomes before what comes before when comes before where, and where comes before how. And all these ways of having thought something modifies what the last thing is, which is how, really. But the Toltec taught a syntax which was kinesthetic, auditory, visual, or body, mind, and spirit. And their taxonomy really, which a taxonomy is a hierarchical, logical typed order. And it's quite amazing that a treatise could have come along. And how could that have formed except for such an incredible deep insight which was taught in the universities and in the cities, Cloud taught. And who was really aware of perception is who is real, of course, and all else is dead and is fictional. So it's like a mirror image of you, which you can see your image, but you can see that's fictional, that's not you. Who is real? Who is of warmth and blood in heaven? Heaven to them, the definition of it was the space between two children playing. And so formlessness really was more a cosmological mystery of parent, child and heaven. And these were the three sort of conditions where somebody was in prudence and in our care as the child that leads us, and having things be more heaven, which the definition of it, as we talked about, is the space between two children playing.
That's a beautiful definition.
Anyway, so an image really isn't perfect, but it's absolutely a fractal of the total, you see. And that is perfect because it's something which is universal in the way we think about things and we do things, which across culture is the same. But like this universal shape in physics is something which I discovered is called a jubbit, and it's not a cubit. It's actually like a scalar shape, which is three-dimensional, and it fills space, and it makes a shape which is a triovoid plasm, which is exactly an amount which fills one evolution, in where an ovoid is you've got a spiral totalness, and once you've gone round once, come back to where you start, you've got 1,432 arcs that fit exact within this, you see. And so it's something which adds up to 9, and it's a fractal of the universe which creates another universe. And it's like the B flat, which is the note of the background note of the universe, and that's the color mauve, sort of. It's the color of our skin, what the color is that all of us have in the bottom of our feet, all over the earth. So matter really forms very deep in space, well below the level of hydrogen, you see. And you've got 4D printing, of course, and of Path of Formlessness is more for you and I, more just like a bit of a book given to you here, and you're being able to read between the pages, sort of thing, inside, looking within self as you pass through these podcasts and things that we have done ahead of us here. It's something which modifies the things which you're hearing, and the Path of Formlessness really is what's given, and this was sort of more in the 80s, and it spawned really a more resurgence more on this topic, and who's real and who is aware of perception. And so what's really a reflection really like is really dead, of course, and something written is dead in relation to you who is living, which is of trust, and this is a higher order than any documentedness, you see. And so it's a witnessness of your nativity, for instance, and this was held by all of us who are living as we witness what this is, and this is I within you, you see, and this is eternal and didn't die and wouldn't die where your body is either. And it's 50% of yourself in the Toltec tradition, which is teaching people how to be more formless and have an empty center where nothing really sticks or anything, in fact. And so something is deductive reason and inductive, because no confounding variable or bias is. And if you could keep in mind who is real and who is aware of perception, it's not perception itself. And so having an impartiality to fact where some independence is, it's sort of absolute evermore, mate. Yeah? And would you say mentalness really is where suffering is, and there's no such suffering where things are beyond the mind?
Well, I think there's pain in there somewheres.
It's yeah, that's right. As in the mind, and it's from need. And where no need is because someone has an empty centre, they don't have any pain at all. Movement really is the broadest pathway, of course, to reprogram anyone's brain. Because if you wire in a new movement experience, then the mind could conceive new possibility, of course. So awareness really is sort of your really who is real is not a stagnant spot, you see. It's not about a stagnant spot somewhere. It's really non-local. It's more universal, you see. It's more permanent versus, localized per se, or having a structure per se. But it's really more empty as stellar space, which I is just like a canvas background. And the way that works is it's like a bridge, the bridge has to be empty, and sort of like a glass pane has to be clear for the sun to shine through. But the warmth would shine through and go through a brick half, and fill it, and then slowly but sure that as a heat bank, it slowly releases its warmth through the night. So all the warmth that was kept, was like a quality circle in us, basically. But if we're empty, of course, and we're non-localized, and it's more universal, and we could see which is, which the body is, and that's only 4% of the things we could see. It's like the stars here. All of us could be a bit of missing the background of the darkness of what the sky is itself in patches where there are, which dark matter is and energy. And so light could have just caused us to be looking at things where our finger is, and we could miss the splendor more of the moon, sort of thing. Like water is taking its own shape where anything is. You can imagine something about our discernment and being impartial where we are. It's sort of getting rid of all the places where sticky factor could have been. And this is talking more literal and becoming excellent at what's literal versus the things which is illiterate. But what's illiteral itself, of course, isn't a practice too much of anything, but it could be, because it could be a synesthesia which is being applied, and underneath that someone is actually using that to process information on another level, even in a different set of information totally. So all that's needed really is a speck, that's what we're talking about, of this, which is a fractal of it, and it's a shoreless ocean behind the back of your eyes, you see. And if somebody is unblinking, like we talked about in the program there back, they don't have as many accessing cues and things. They're more associated, that's for sure. And the more in their center of gravity, within their base of support, versus leaning or doing something far over in a horizontal condition. But where somebody is soft evermore, in their charisma, and they're kind, gentle and allowing, it's sort of a great for children to be around. Animals love it, even insects love you, basically. So power of formlessness is really where someone has this in their hands, and it's sort of something that's universal, mate. But meta meaning over the top of this, the vestibular sense, and how somebody is forward, back, up, down, and using their vestibular sense itself. And that's how many could just clear away allergy simple by doing a short-term hypnotherapeutic session, you see. But it's interesting that out of all the forms of therapy, what would be the reason you would imagine that, how many sessions? Short-term hypnotherapy only had 3 sessions, and they healed everything. And like chiropractics and all sorts of other physicians and psychiatry sometimes had up to 600 sessions and hadn't sort of really done something per se, or couldn't have affected things in the same way. So it's an interesting thing that short-term hypnotherapy is just directly being able to cause what the therapeutic actually is in the time spent where someone is in giving instruction as to kind of like what could be carried out afterwards, sort of thing.
Does that therapy wear off over time?
Well, yeah, it's about like what we're doing ongoing versus like just kind of having been acted upon. But if thought really as matter just is temporary, like we've just said, and has great limitation where that is itself, a power really is in the formlessness because something is non-verbal, something's analogical, something has an emotion, something is energy in motion as movement through space, which is the definition of time. These are things more abstract and temporal in relation to who, which is real, which is I, which is 50% of self is empty as stellar spaces, and the other 50% is care simple, that's it. But everything else behind that's kind of not you in front of God, you see, basically, or Allah, or ways that you could think about the term of what this is. It's really sort of a void and avoided. And so what's avoided is really rigid identity in the circumstance of things, which involves anybody not having any much capacity to be able to be adaptable, and certainly not having any much more flexibility, and fluidness, like you were talking about in the beginning of the program, where somebody really has easy ability to be able to hover. But so these things sort of all helpful because you could be breaking ice to be able to clear away some stubborn habit, you see, and that suddenly those are things which become more broken. But what's unpredictable benefit really is what's sudden often, and personality sort of more balanced, sort of where your orientation is, where internal or external, or one's referential indexing, like to get information 50% internal, 50% external. And in the past programs we talked about it, if you listen, go back through it, you're going to see all sorts of selective restrictive violations which cause spike wave to pass through the brain with brain freeze. Those are 4 Hertz cycles which could predict brain freeze, and suddenly sort of what's unpredictable could have a benefit, of course, because where the mind could have gone to confusion, suddenly whatever gone in there that makes sense is sort of in an imprint state, you see. So it's typical that sort of...
Me and brain freeze go back a long way.
Yes, because when we have this ourselves, the intelligence of it is that what's said, like you were saying earlier, coming in for a landing, it is a fact that a lot of other things are eliminated, matter of fact, and it's sort of like spellbound, could you say, but it's more like life is more what's taking your breath away more than how many breaths that you had or something. So it's really like love is what you're falling into, and so it's no boundaries where intimacy is, where a subject is. And so if typically somebody really didn't have any learned response where they could have fallen suddenly, you've got reflexive conditions which are going on, and it's not into our unusual thinking patterns or anything that's like that, in fact. So being in a void really is just like, well, you've got a present and you're going to unwrap it, and that is the gift. And so these are things which is something unknown, of course, you see. And so knowing itself could really be a disaster, because it's not necessary that this more is I-aware, which I-awareness is awareness itself outright, where knowing is sort of a component perhaps of something. But keeping energy, or sometimes having lost it, somebody really could have a great amplitude of energy as they've got hemisynchronization going on between the hemispheres, and they've engaged things which is positive because that's accessed the frontal cortex ever more, and it's lit it up. And so suddenly the frontal cortex is connected to the back of the brain more, where action takes place, and it's engaged in a complementariness of what's internal Maloo, and it's a 50-50 sort of a balance where somebody's sort of more in a balanced state. Yeah, and so it could be just said, of course, you can imagine that 4-4 and 4 time causes fear, of course it does, and brain freeze. And that's what it does. It actually stops you from being able to contemplate. And that is the act of war that's done on you, basically, where that is. But if we create a surprise where things are, and you've got really room inside more, you're in the number 9, and you've got, an elliptical, and that's a 3 beat. And it's sort of the maneuver is there. You could move on and can jump in and out, and everything is good on a pentatonic scale. And this is a better scale for everyone to learn music from. But if you were only taught to go up the scale, not down, how bad is that? It means your response in life would have only been to go out of yourself, and you wouldn't have been able to have energy to preserve anything, in fact, you see. And so that's really wrong in education, where people wouldn't have been taught the scale to go down and in, versus they only got, as kids, taught the scale to go up. And so these are things which are maneuvers, of course, and a formlessness is as you could handle things ever more. And your opponent really is where you're more unpredictable, but some opponent could be predictable, and this is not going to be necessary for you to see ease of ability being eye-aware, where flexibility is and fluidness is. It's where somebody wasn't, you'd have to be the most yourself. And so one really is forced more to adapt and unique and have critical sorts of situation, really have more specifics, which could help somebody deal where stress is, matter of fact, and not have to have stress per se. But feeling sort of self-aware is sort of more where you have emptiness inside, and you cultivated this. And this takes time because nothing is certain, and no law is fixed. And so to protect one's own self, where to be not defeated, of course, is really far more likely you'll succeed, of course, and a strategic advantage where something is more a surprise of something off guard relative. But what's unpredictable that suddenly more could cause certainty in where an opponent is, because you could have no mini battles and wouldn't have to, you see, because you could never have to go past the mark that you'd actually aim for. And so art is, the means for us to be able to get things done. And it's sort of like you and I coming back full circle to the beginning of the program, having a sort of an impartial judgment. And so that's what formlessness is. It's really not having a bias. Yeah. And so like you've got straw man argument, which we talked about. What about slippery slope? What's that?
That is when people really don't know the information that they're arguing about.
Yeah, so a fact didn't exist and they just went on as if it did. Okay. What about like ad hoc? It means like something happened at the same time and space, but most of these things are not cause and effect orientated. We just think that it did because something was in the same time and space. But the fact is that you've got a contextual validity, and as all fact could be put, every single thing is an inference would add up to that, you see.
I can make anything sound like fact.
Yeah, so we could cause something to be fact, that's right, and it takes a moment for someone to come to be more doing what this is itself, because it's truth-telling, like you were saying. So sort of then there's no conflicted interest either, you see.
Right.
And so if the world matches like the inner world, like you're pointing out, like the outer world, this could be the real reset for people, being more MT, and being sure bettered about things coming in and being able to get this ever more. I mean, wouldn't this be due diligence done? And would you have a feeling that where someone is, they could have not maybe done that, but you could help where that is, because you've got generalization where you could listen into programs past as part of the process that the brain uses. The other one is deletion and distortion.
Speaking of doing their due diligence, if somebody wanted to approach detachment, what's an exercise or something that they can do to help them get started?
Am I aware? It means simple that you're empty, you see. So if you're empty, it means you're in this state. And it's sort of like a state like in Switzerland, you can hit a birdie, as you see people do, or hit a crack an ace, which just was dynamite. There's no way that someone could respond because it was a bit too quick, you know what I mean? And so you and I, you can anticipate where the ball is going to be, if you can arrive there, because otherwise you would never get there.
Were you a rod lever?
Well, I measured the amount of speed that was behind a basket, a ball that was, and what, like in tennis, for instance, and what the speed of the ball was, and which you'd have to be anticipating. Yeah, so it's precognition. Yeah, it's something before cognition.
Would you say approaching detachment is more of a mental thing, not a physical thing?
It's absolutely that this eye awareness is one of the fundamental things. What you're talking about here is a yoga, and then there's everything else as secondary forms of it. But the primary form is this inquiry as to who am I, and I'm solid about absolutely writing or thinking or doing or breathing and acting at every moment, knowing about what the concept of mind is versus most people language might not have approach what the meaning of this is, you see. But if we do, we're sort of honouring a stranger, because then everybody's just falling into you, of course. And it's sort of an event that's external, which is your inner principle, and yet prejudice and bias isn't existed, because it's sort of how you keep your own self company inside. This, like we're talking about how relaxed your shoulders are, for instance, how relaxed your tummy is. But like, if you've never thought, nobody's ever said, like you said the other day, or I didn't hear anybody say, well, shut all your internal dialogue down. Well, that's what the whole program is more about. It's an incredible thing that in the East, everybody knows about I, and in the West, everybody knows about the body. But doesn't nobody ever, with the Toltecs teach you, a balance exists between I and am, and that this is sort of a flow, and it's not sort of clinging to a pleasantry bank, and you don't bring up those memories, or it's not clinging to adversive bank, which is bringing up those memories either. It's sort of in a flow. It's not bringing up any of those memories. And so somebody's finally is in not of any proper condition except for being impartial in judgment. And this is the most beautiful thing ever that one could be, because it's really the conduct of his speech and the patterning of this, which is really something as of a practice itself, where respect and honour really is, and faith. Of course, you're dropping ever more into a deeper dignity, of course. But I would say, look, where somebody has charisma like you do, something just naturally is, you see, and it's like a fractal, and everything you do and touch, matter of fact, has a piece and a bit about what this is truly. And so it's not really of having to be of influence on us, because no pressure on the outside or inside has to be for what this is. It's a self-autonomy in an interrelatedness, and when somebody's got what this is, you see now they have the math of it. And so we're coming into more of this as a JC quanta in languaging, but in eye awareness you've got an absence of bias, you see, and you've got no confounding variable, because so in smart contract, which we would have done for talking in another program, it would be like you've got a vending machine and things are done, and it would be like, oh yeah, well, we got the sea, the oceans cleaned up, and people into Lifehouse Sustainable Community. We had international relations, borders were dropped because there was no reason, because there was absolute order where we were, versus the things which doesn't exist like that. But it's really a matter of how do you create this, and having good knowledge in eye awareness and having a good reasoning, of course, is really independent of one's own self-autonomy per se, or interrelatedness. Just is common sense, and this is sort of more a spontaneous creative intelligence itself.
Can somebody achieve perfect detachment instantly?
Yeah, sometimes that happened because somebody fell off a bike. Yeah, things happen, near-death experience, all sorts of little things that could have occurred. But reality really is where somebody comes to. And for me, for instance, it took me a year and a half of being with my teacher before suddenly I became aware fully. And I remember the moment it happened. In fact, it was sudden, because after that I could hear the vestibular sense where how it was being used and in analog, meaning just non-verbal language as well as language itself. And I had super consciousness suddenly, you see. So, you know, this caused me to become so incredible where I was, and each 1% that I got toward what this is, but chipping away at things. First it is that we can polarize to our own first attention and do it in the most negative terms possible. It's like now we're putting something in a bucket where you would just clear it away, versus a lot of people just sort of dabble with something, but they haven't really said they would clear something away. Whereas you put it out of sight, or put it in a sense that stinks, for instance, it's like no longer feasible where that is, sort of thing. So being eye-aware really is not really having any bias whatsoever, like I was saying in the early part of it, and that actual your hoveringness or coming in is as a visitor. So it's really in a gamma wave. The pilot, he's sort of not blinking too much because he's landing craft. He's hovering in this craft, so it's pretty amazing. But we could have all this automatic relative, and it just does these things for us, just like a ride does, you know, on some of these Disney big rides that, you know, you can exist. But you know that virtual reality, where goggles are, these sorts of things are coming to be more, and the math that we were talking about that we took really gives you this absolute influence. So you've got no conflictedness where the sense is, and you can operate something, you know, far away and do that exact with judgment. And so where the inner world is more matching the outer world, you've really got a real reset having gone on, you know, in every way that you could think about it, like financially and energetically, economically. And you've got an arming what is give where need is, and where need no longer is, pain isn't, like you were saying. And it's if you're honouring a stranger, of course, then what could they do but yet fall back into you? And it's all that what you could need is an event which is external in any inner procedure, of course, and where prejudice is or bias, it really could have kept someone not necessarily from having company, you know, between the parts and flow between the parts. So gyroscopic sorts of device which keep us sort of level when we come in for the landing are the very things which, you know, allow helicopters to fly in the sky, matter of fact, you see. And we will come to have foils, and those foils, like cone foils, will shape the air, hug things, and cause curving dynamics of airflow and stuff. And it's sort of you and I being of a formlessness, it's a more stillness, a silence, and a transparency. Yes?
Well, and you know what? The landing is just the beginning. That's all we got, folks, today. I hope you enjoyed it. Of course, we'll talk about it again. Dr. Jubb, give us something simple that'll brighten our days.
Well, I think feeling alive, the body to see in the mind's eye empty.
All right, I like it. And you know what? Flexibility, great way to start approaching detachment, flexibility in the mind. Take us out, Dr. Jubb.